Einen schönen guten Abend. Vielen Dank fürs Kommen. Sehr mutig durch den Regen. Besonders, aber auch deswegen, weil viele Leute vielleicht zum ersten Mal hier sind. Das haben wir unserem Partner bei dieser Organisation, dem österreichisch-französischen Zentrum, zu verdanken. Und ich danke dir und dem Botschafter. A greeting also to the eminent panelists for this evening's discussion. Margit Maximilian, Irene Horace, Thierry Vicoulon et Stéphane Gompertz. Et j'invite maintenant Monsieur l'ambassadeur Gilles Bécoud de France pour faire une allocution, suivie par le secrétaire général du Centre Austro-Français pour les rapprochements en Europe. Je vous en prie.
Mesdames et Messieurs les membres et responsables du Forum Kreisky et du CFA, dear fellow ambassadors, Mesdames et Messieurs les intervenants, parmi lesquels je me permets, après avoir salué l'Assemblée, de saluer tout particulièrement, mais non exclusivement, mes compatriotes, l'ambassadeur Gompertz, membre du conseil scientifique du CFA, ainsi que M. Vircoulon, venu de l'IFRI, en bonne compagnie au premier rang de cette Assemblée. Herzlichen Dank für diese Einladung zum Kreisky-Forum, einem Ort, den ich als Diplomat und Historiker nur bewundern kann. Das Nachdenken über die Beziehung zwischen Europa und Afrika ist eine historische Notwendigkeit. Es geht nämlich darum, die Geschichte der Kolonialisierung und Entkolonialisierung zu überdenken. Und es geht auch darum, die Geschichte der Afrikaner in ihrer Vielfalt, also nicht nur die Geschichte Afrikas als Objektkontinent zu betrachten. Und ich danke dem CFA und dem Kreisky-Forum, uns zu helfen, diese Neugestaltung nicht nur in die Geschichte, sondern auch in die Zukunft Europas einzuordnen. Before giving the floor to the organizers and to the experts, I shall deliver just 3 pithy remarks, renewing my thanks to the organizers. 3 pithy remarks to highlight how the Euro-African reflection makes sense to illustrate the partnership of CFA, the Österreichisch-Französische Zentrum, and our embassy in the framework of our Schwarzenbergplatz forum. First of all, it makes sense, as it has been, by the way, perfectly put in your flyer, it makes sense in the priorities of European Commission and European Union, and precisely in the context of the priorities of the French presidency of the European Council, to give a new and fresh impetus to a partnership between the European Union and the African Union, starting by the idea that a sovereign Europe has to be an open Europe and has to develop relations of stability with its closest neighbor. I have obviously nothing to add, and we are waiting for your analysis of the consequences of the summit of Brussels. But right now, we are perhaps able to recognize that the partnership is assiduously working towards the ambition of establishing a real reciprocal partnership, a reciprocal and perhaps a multilateral one. And I am sure we will have some comments about multilateralism, about China and Russia in this multilateralism in the current predicament. But we are waiting for your analysis. My second observation as a diplomat should be just to mention that this global diplomatic approach is nothing but a new geopolitical approach. In an interview to the French journal Le Grand Continent, the former Minister of French Foreign Affairs wanted to address the French presidency policy with this simple and key notion of a new geopolitics. I quote, "We agree that the future of Europe is geopolitical, which clearly means that citizens are looking for a new kind of geopoliticals with new mechanisms of global solidarity with the other continents." So perhaps this new start in the relationships between the two continents is not only a necessity for Africans, but a need for Europeans to rediscover a positive sense of international politics in the public space or sphere of citizenship, in a positive meaning of politicization. And for my third observation, let me switch to another language, my own, to close, if I may. Oui, ce séminaire, comme en général toute l'action du CFA et du Forum Kreisky, nous montre clairement la place de la réflexion partagée et de la transaction intellectuelle dans les relations de l'Europe à autrui, aux autres continents. C'est banal de ma part que de le rappeler, sauf que dans le cas de l'Afrique, c'est aussi rappeler la nécessité de reconstruire un dialogue qui a longtemps été, nous le savons bien, un dialogue asymétrique, et de le reconstruire aussi sur la culture. La culture comme dialogue, ce que nous avons, dialogue des arts, ce que nous avons voulu faire, par exemple, à l'ambassade et à l'Institut français avec le concert des continents qui a eu lieu au Musikverein le mois dernier. La culture comme réparation de l'histoire, certes, avec les restitutions d'œuvres d'art, mais pas simplement. La culture et l'art aussi comme base d'une nouvelle transmission des valeurs, et la culture comme ressource économique équitable entre les deux continents. C'est ainsi à un homme de culture africain, plutôt critique d'ailleurs au début, que le président Macron avait confié une mission importante en octobre 2021, juste avant notre présidence, le philosophe Achille Mbembe. Et je lui laisserai, pour ouvrir votre séminaire, si vous le permettez, et pour laisser la parole au secrétaire général, le dernier mot. Mbembe dit que les Africains et les Européens doivent se retrouver. Mais pour que les Africains et les Européens se retrouvent, il faut au moins trois choses. Il faut la déliaison. Voilà un beau néologisme, presque poétique. C'est-à-dire, au sens où la liaison était relation de force, il faut dénouer cette liaison. Mais il faut aussi la mobilité pour renouer avec ce qu'il appelle l'éthique du passant. Et enfin, il faut que tout cela puisse aboutir à ce qui est désigné comme un nouvel entrelacement. Même si je sais bien que le temps des poètes et des philosophes n'est pas notre temps à nous, n'est pas le temps des diplomates, n'est pas celui des analystes, je vous confie, mesdames et messieurs, ces propos en vous remerciant encore, vous, de cette belle initiative qui n'avait jamais été aussi actuelle.
Let me just add a few words, because I think what Ambassador Gilles Pécou has just said in focusing on three sets of issues sums it up very well, and I don't think I could add much on substance. But let me just say how we really came to conceive of this seminar. And the ambassador talked about geopolitics, and indeed when we talked with the French embassy, with the ambassador more particularly about what we could do together to make the work of the Centre Franco-Autrichien also a bit more meaningful in the context of current global affairs. We, of course, hit a number of topics which we thought we could do together, and I'm very grateful for the ambassador to have suggested that we could have a series of joint projects, which he termed the Rencontres du Schwarzenbergplatz, where, of course, the French embassy is located. And we started earlier this year with a great event at the French embassy, which was focusing more on Europe, of the academics, of culture, going a bit away from politics and economics, which of course were the mainstay of the center's work, and also transcending a bit geographically what we had been focusing on traditionally, mainly the future of Europe, the neighborhood in the East, the Western Balkans, and also the countries of the Eastern Partnership, which of course are now in the focus, or one of them, in a way none of us could have imagined, namely Ukraine. And well before the war in Ukraine, when we had a discussion at the French embassy, we thought we cannot look at the world without looking more closely at the relationship between Europe and Africa. Africa being, on the one hand, a geopolitical partner, but also no less of a neighbor than Eastern Europe. And I think for that reason, it made eminent sense, also because after a hiatus of 5 years, the European Union held a summit with Africa in February, indeed just a few days before the invasion of the Ukraine, which of course also will have an impact on EU-African relations, and I'm sure this will come out also in this discussion. So I'm very grateful to you, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, cher Gilles, to the Kreisky Forum for having agreed to partner this and host it. And of course, I'm grateful for the panelists who have agreed to join for this event, and I'm sure we will have a very exciting evening. So once again, thank all of you also for coming, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. The subject of this evening's discussion is the state of relations between Europe and Africa, or between the European Union and Africa. Now, 4 months ago, we had started out with the preparations of the latest, the 6th EU summit in Brussels, noting that there was a widespread and growing sentiment of fatigue, even of irritation, and this even more so on the African side. We had intended to explore the reasons of the situation, and in order to make a new start possible, to see what could be done to change this. But we had to recognize that old points of contention had not disappeared, and new ones were piling up by the week. To witness, the present chair of the AUC, the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki, declared recently, referring to the food crisis, that Africa was becoming a collateral damage of the Ukraine situation. And last week, the president of Senegal, Macky Sall, traveled to Sochi in his capacity of president of the African Union to discuss wheat shipments and to offer African mediation. So, relations between the two continents take on a totally different relevance in a new geopolitical setting. This was said by the ambassador also. Now, the first point in this evening, substantive point, is a video done with Dr. Tony Hastrup, a senior lecturer at the University of Stirling in Great Britain. She is also co-editor of the Routledge Handbook on EU-Africa relations. So what can be more apt as to have an introduction from an African side on this topic. What follows is now the interview with her.
I think if we were thinking about the fatigue, you know, it's such a contested, I would say, contested idea. But I mean, I think one way to think about it is, you know, both partners are kind of at a point where they've been before. And I think that that perhaps accounts for some of the fatigue, that a lot of the conversations that led into the summit this year has been had before. We had a lot of the same kind of concerns prior to 2005. In the immediate aftermath of 2005, after the EU strategy for Africa. Certainly, it's partly what inspired the Joint Africa-EU strategy, this idea that we can move towards a renewal, assuming, of course, that, you know, the broader context of this relationship, particularly since 1957, has more or less played out in a way that hasn't left either partner completely satisfied. And I would agree with you that, especially on the African side, that there was very much an impetus to change the relationship. And I can speak to why that, you know, why that's been the case. And I think there's just a lot of frustration that, you know, when we had this conversation prior to 2007, and then we had the joint Africa EU strategy, that there was a, you know, there was hope that there could be a renewal in this relationship, and in particular, a renewal that accorded African countries a status of equality with European, or specifically EU member states and the EU institutions, but also a sense of partnership. And there is a sense that that hope has not really been realized. And so successive summits have tended to go back to that sort of conversation about equality and partnership. And the European Union has tended to reiterate that it definitely wants that. And so there seems to be, on the one hand, both partners see where the problem is, but there doesn't seem to have been a resolution as to how to actually fix this problem. And certainly in the lead up to 2022, to the sort of belated summit, this was very much the attitude, this sort of, you know, we're tired of having the same conversation over and over again. There's an opportunity to change once again, since, you know, the world has gone through a massive upheaval because of COVID. So what can we get out of it? And the argument I made in the comment that in the comment piece that you're referring to is to say, you know, there was a bit of a give, but it was a sort of incremental change that we've seen over many years. And so we're kind of left in the same place once again, that we don't really have the sort of radical change that, to my mind, and certainly a lot of, I would say, African elites agree, that we need to sort of reconfigure this relationship. So that, you know, on the one hand, that perhaps explains why there's that feeling and that sense of just, we're tired of having the same conversations over and over again. But then, you know, there's another dimension to that, which has to do with the fact that, you know, if we're tired of having this conversation over and over again, and we don't want to keep having this conversation, increasingly, the European Union is not the only choice in town. So we don't even have to keep having the conversation. And there presents a problem, particularly for the European Union, because, you know, even if you disagree on certain things, being in a space to keep having the conversation is still a good thing. But where you have other alternatives that might then relegate the European Union to sort of secondary status, a secondary partner, this does create tensions within the relationship between African countries, their institutions, EU and EU member state countries. And of course, those alternatives are other actors like China, like Russia, Japan, Turkey, just to name a few.
And what would Africa expect from Europe, if anything, at the moment?
Right. I think that's a really good question. So for me personally, and I'm sure that, there are different views around this, I don't think that the demands of Africans necessarily changed, right? I think that previously there was perhaps no choice but to acquiesce to what it is that the European Union wanted. And what's changed here is precisely the fact that there are now more options. So one of the things that we have to understand is that, the EU, for better, for good or for bad, has been, at least rhetorically, the biggest champion of regional integration in Africa. And so when we look at areas like peace and security, which is sort of the one area where most African countries more or less agree that something has to be done on, and a lot of the solutions, there is more or less general agreement and coherence too. The European Union has been the biggest champion of that peace and security aspirations, mostly because it supports the African Union, but it also supports other regional economic communities in this particular policy area. Now, what's changed? Well, on the one hand, prior to more recently, the EU, for example, was not necessarily authorized to fund the purchase or procurement of lethal weapons. So that's changed now, which gives the EU a bit more options. Previously, if any of that was requested or required by African actors, they went to other actors. But the engagement of those other actors was not as fertile on the African continent with respect to peace and security. That is now changing. So, you now have, I think, proper options with respect to peace and security, where previously, of course, France dominated, and indeed the European Union itself. We know that the EU dominates not just with respect to its partnerships with the African Union or the regional economic communities, but if you sort of look at EU, the number of EU missions that are currently in operation, the majority of them are indeed in Africa. But now you've got options. China is now invested in the area of peace and security where it didn't used to be. It sort of moved outside of that realm of just economic infrastructure growth to looking at areas of peace and security. Certainly, we know that Russia has very much been involved in the areas of peace and security, but also traditional, I wouldn't say partners, but, traditional European actors in the area of peace and security have not had an excellent reputation of late. And in particular, I would highlight France, that, the sort of French connection, as it were, has not been as productive as it should or could be. And in general, there's a questioning of the very real and negative impact of some of EU member states, and again, in particular, France, activities on the continent. So what we see is, on the one hand, there are more options in this particular policy and issue area, but there's also a growing sense of discontent, which is fueled by an increasing agency on the part of African actors to actually speak up and to say that, the way things are and the status quo is no longer enough for the aspirations that Africans have for themselves.
Thank you. There are a number of other issues that we have mentioned. Migration is one, vaccines and COVAX is another one. Climate change is a new one. Now, the question I would have to you, in view of the rather increasing difficulties, and what, in your opinion, would have to be done on both sides in order to come to a better and more constructive relationship and kind of discussion. In mentioning this, I would also say the one new element on the EU side at this summit was the Global Gateway Initiative. Mm-hmm. But there is a lot of money in that. Now, I remember how often there was a lot of money and it did not always come, but at least there's one outlook. So these are two things. The one, the global gateway is a new point. The other, what can we do, so to say, in our day-to-day contacts in preparing for a next summit that will put us into a better starting situation.
What we saw in the lead up to this particular summit was very different, where you had clear positions outlined by the African Union, and this position signed on to by most African Union member states, which are all African countries currently. This is a very different way of engaging with external actors in general, not just the European Union. So if we see more of this, a bit more coherence on the part of African countries, where the positions are quite clear, where the recommendations for how to achieve those positions are quite clear, I think it might make things a bit easier for European, European states, but also European institutions. But of course, I think that's in a perfect world, because European states and institutions are working for their own interests as well. We have a commission that is very much moved away from this idea of just, norms and values to one that is about geopolitics and the idea of pragmatism. And one might argue, well, that's the reality of where we are now. But from my side, in my opinion, one of the things that this has done is that, on the one hand, previously, even the EU has agreed that, Africa needs to be sort of thought of in its own terms, has to be engaged on in its own terms. It feels right now that a lot of policy that is being made towards Africa is not really about Africa or Africans, but just about countering other actors on the continent. And I don't think that that is a sustainable position. I think whatever happens going forward to sort of regain that trust, to sort of correct where we're sort of seeing a divergence between sort of the EU and the AU positions, that it will be really important for the European Union and its actors to take Africans and Africa on their own terms based on what it is that they need. I think that it's the least that can happen given sort of the context of prior relations. I think that that is what is owed to this relationship, to the nature of this relationship. But it also means, of course, that the European Union must be comfortable with the fact that, again, there are these options on the African continent. The fact that there are now more options does not mean that it is necessarily a challenge to the European Union, unless the European Union chooses to make it a challenge. And the only way that happens is if the African position is not being integrated into the broader context of Africa-EU relations. And so when we look at the outcomes of the summit that's just passed, we know that there were some concessions around vaccines, for example, but it did not even go nearly to the point where the African side could say, we lose, you win some, you lose some. In the end, it was the European position that sort of prevailed. And Africa is in a position to accept it as it is, but it also means that if something comes along that is better from other areas, then they might probably take it, and the EU might view that as being challenging to its own position. But we're all looking at this happening in real time. The other aspect, there are other examples. So for example, some colleagues have argued that the EU's aspirations around its own Green Deal and what it wants to do with that in international politics might not be the best for developing countries, a lot of which are in Africa. If we look at the EU's outlook around trade, the EU has been pushing this economic partnership agreements for decades now. It is still something that African countries don't want. And they're very, very clear as to why they don't want it, how they don't want it, what the potential alternatives are. And yet it is something that the European Union consistently pushes. So the question has to be asked, why? Is the African voice not enough in determining how they want to engage with their external partners? After all, again, there are other options. We can also look at the issue of migration. It is very clear what's the perception of what the European Union wants. The European Union says it's about human rights. It says it's about protecting people from dying at sea, but a lot of Africans don't see it that way. It is still very raw seeing slave markets of Black Africans in Libya at a time when the EU was sort of saying, you know, our options were either to build third-party processing centers or to give money to the Libyan Coast Guard in a way that is not necessarily safe for Africans. And so where you have the EU saying something that is not even, doesn't seem consistent with its own values, and insisting that what it is going to do is different from what it's saying, and what it's going to do is best, even when there are alternatives being proposed by Africans, will continue to create tensions. On a pragmatic level, I do understand that means that if we kind of want to see any change, I think the European Union is going to have to take a step back and reassess what it is about the relationship with Africa that it thinks it's important, whether it wants to ensure that relationship is as strong as it could be. And that might mean really reflecting on how it thinks about what its interests are and how it thinks about what its values are and how those are enacted in the African context.
That was Tony Hastrup. It was on the whole a very clear statement no, we don't want to have more of the same. There are other options. What I said already, that some of the old contentious points were still existing and still irking, and the European Union would have to listen more closely to Africa. There are many detailed points, and it's not for me now to comment on this. This is why we have assembled our panel, and I would now ask Margit Maximilian to take the floor. Margit Maximilian is known to most of you. She's probably the most well-known correspondent on African matters, both for the radio and television. Some of you might also think about the book she wrote a few years ago, Schrecklich schönes Afrika. Even this encapsulates a little bit the prejudice that exists here in these both directions. So now Margit is back from an extensive travel in Africa, and she will tell us what she has experienced in her direct contact there. Margit, please.
Yes, thank you, Georg. So that's exactly, I've been invited to talk about people on the ground. So I want to reflect on the last recent trips I did. And first I have to say I wanted to go to South Africa to see how this country is doing after such a long period of COVID problems. And of course we didn't have any news about South Africa in Austrian news in all that period. So I was going to leave in March, but then the war in Ukraine broke out, and I was paralyzed, like as I think we all were. And then, of course, I had to postpone to April, but more important, I had to completely rethink all the stories I was planning to do in South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, because the focus had shifted completely. And everything revolved around the Ukraine, and without the context, stories out of Africa would simply have had no chance to be on air in Austrian news. So then, of course, I started to deepen in Russian-African relations. I learned about all these wheat problems, wheat prices, hunger crisis in parts of the Horn and West Africa. And then there on the ground, I had still all these pictures in mind of Ukraine and of the Ukraine war, of our coverage in tips. And then when I was on the ground, I was suddenly confronted with the fact that interview partners, people on the streets, and even friends, best friends, close friends, all totally were pro-Russia. I was really astonished, and they were thinking, they were telling things like the West, and that includes, of course, the EU and myself. So you just got too close, and with the expansion towards Russian borders. Cyril Ramaphosa, president of South Africa, repeated this on TV. He said, this war could have been avoided if NATO heeded the warning signs. So I found myself in constant discussions with friends and people explaining that NATO, that we didn't just force anybody to join or to do something, and lots of other arguments, just to set things straight and get a little bit of our point of view. And that's, I think, is on a large scale the same with EU-Africa relation. The war shifted the focus, shifted it away from important things like fighting terrorism, developing democratic institutions, shifting it away from all areas of important concern on the continent, like the war in Ethiopia, crisis in Sudan, Mali, etc. You know. And this, I'm sure it also adds up to the fact that African states don't want to join the sanctions regime against Russia so easily as most Western countries would have actually preferred. They remain ambivalent, they remain neutral, of course, because of their old ties with the Soviet Union, because of sentimental memories and gratitude for it, especially in Southern Africa, of course. But on the other hand, also because of double standards concerning human rights. When it comes to the question, what conflict is worth intervening in? They find it insensitive, I was told, when, for example, President Zelensky said at this massacre in Bucha, before I left, he said how African students were treated. I saw these pictures on BBC or Al Jazeera, I don't remember, where black people were literally thrown off the trains when they also tried to flee the Russian bombs. And of course these pictures were shared on YouTube in the internet, and I guess that really hurts. So in shifting focus, I was filming some stories about the climate crisis and hunger, which is very much exacerbated dramatically by the lack of wheat shipments, and we know all that from Russia and Ukraine. So everybody groans under the enormously increased prices, from petrol to fertilizer to bread. In a dry zone in Kenya, I was with communities that hadn't seen rain for 5 years. They were far away from the next little town. They have no car. They have, anyway, they have not enough money to buy additional food at, on these prices anyway. So still I was astonished that they know, or at least they say, when you ask them why does that happen, they say it's because of Ukraine. So even at the remotest part of the world, 15,000 kilometers away, they say it's because of Ukraine and they are pleading, please stop your war over there. So again, if I'm allowed to simplify a little bit, I think people in Africa are becoming innocent victims for something they can't help again. From a climate crisis, they have contributed the least in the world to a miserable war in Europe they really have nothing to do with. And the effects of the war in Africa are actually greater than in other parts of the world, especially with this food crisis and hunger that threatens millions. And that after COVID. We heard already, that's the next point I want to tell a little bit, because also in Africa, perhaps, except at the airports, you don't feel anything anymore. But still there is a great deal of resentment, which I think is very important for EU-African relations. I was in Africa even before there were vaccines. Of course, many people interviewed back then, they wouldn't have got vaccinated anyway because they were afraid or other things, whatever. But then, if they wanted to, there were no vaccines, despite many efforts, COVAX, etc. But vaccines hardly ever arrived in Africa at that time. Because Europe and the West had already hoarded everything, sometimes even before it was on the market. I did many stories on that, also one big one, a longer film for our magazine Weltjournal. And this issue of vaccine injustice has always been everywhere when you were talking to people. So, but the pharmaceutical industry simply didn't want to share the patents and their know-how. Even after no less than 100 member states of the World Treaty Organizations have called to relax intellectual property rights, at least for a time. Nobel laureates had called for it, experts, a number of lawyers, NGOs like Amnesty, MSF, everybody. But no chance. Europe rejected, Austria also. And then on top of it, it was often said, you are not capable of producing vaccines yourself anyway, which has seriously offended a number of states, which saw themselves very well able to produce, at least with some help. One of them, of course, being South Africa. And there I would like to tell a little story about Cyril Ramaphosa again. He gave a long answer on a podium in Dakar, in Senegal, to a question from the audience. And he said, we are the first to say we want to have an endurable partnership with Europe and others. But then he went on talking about mutual respect and shared an example of the lack of respect he felt himself. And he said when first Omicron arrived, he was going to travel to West Africa, and in the wake of that traveling, he received calls of all 4 presidents he was going to meet, and all of them said, yeah, of course we have heard about that Omicron things, but still we want you to come to visit. And they said, what can we do? Can we help you? What can we do? And then he went on, there were calls from Europe with a simple message of saying, we banned travel, thank you, goodbye, see you next time. No discussion, no attempt to hear what our views are, he said, and got a lot of applause for that, of course. So obviously, I really don't want to say everything went good with COVID in Africa. On the contrary, funds have disappeared. In states like Kenya, there was this extreme police brutality to enforce the curfews, and people were even killed by then. But I think relations with Europe have been very, very badly damaged during that period. And yeah, now I think I'm going to stop here because next issue would be Mali, and I think there are other people maybe, and that would take too long. Right. Yeah, just to end, I can say I have to admit no discussions I did change any minds. People thought the same things about Ukraine when I left.
Thank you, Margaret. Makes us think. The next speaker will be Thierry Vircoulon. He is an associate research fellow at the IFRE, the French Research Institute on International Relations, with focus on sub-Saharan Africa. When you look at his website, there are pages of titles of publications. But he wanted to draw your attention to a very recent paper on the renegotiations of the Cotonou Treaty and one on the evolution of the EDF. We will put this on the internet, the link to these papers. So I would ask you to start. And again, I'll stick to about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation. Well, you gave me a very easy task to summarize in 10 minutes 60 years of EU development policy. But before I do that, I just want to give you a bit of economic background about the EU and Africa, or Europe and Africa, not the EU and Africa, but Europe and Africa. So you can assess what is the state of the economic relations. Just, I'm going to go very fast. The trade between Africa and Europe is about 230 billion at the moment. Europe is the first trade partner of Africa. Behind it's China at $200 billion. And it's been on the rise. China has been on the rise. So basically, the European market is important for African exports, and about 1/3 of African export goes to Europe, and to a very limited number of European countries. When it comes to the foreign direct investment, also Europe has been and still is the first source of foreign direct investment for Africa, but it's on the decrease. It's now below at the level of 50%, and basically there's a rise of Chinese investment, as you already know now, and that's why the European is not the share of the European FDI is decreasing. So that's to give you the importance of the economic relations. Basically, what we can say from this economic point of view is that the European markets matter for Africa, but Africa does not matter for the European market. So that's an economic reality that I think should be clearly stated from the very beginning, because of our conversation we're having today. It's like, by the way, it's like for China. When you look at the figures between China and Africa, China is very important trade partner for Africa, but Africa is not an important trade partner for China. So now let's come to that the history of the European development aid towards Africa. Actually, Africa was on the agenda of the European Union from the very beginning, from the Roma Treaty, and as of course a legacy of colonialism, the newly independent African countries benefited from the 60s from the early 60s from European development aid because of the colonial ties that they had with France, Belgium, and Italy, and other countries. Of course, when the UK joined the European Union, they also made sure that their former colonies in Africa will benefit from the European aid policy. And during, I would say, still from the 60s to the 90s, basically there was a very strong focus of that policy on building infrastructure in Africa and integrating Africa in the international trade, because of the development thinking of the time, which basically said to develop a country, you need to have infrastructure and you need to do trade and be integrated into international trade. And so the Europeans built the whole policy around that. But those paradigms actually changed in the 90s with the introduction of other ideas in the development community, such as democratic governance, the focus on democratic governance and human rights for development, the idea that actually budget support would be better than building infrastructure, and the idea that the governance of, meaning the way administration works in those countries was also very important for their development. And there were also, of course, some internal transformation within the European Union. One of those sociological transformation that was quite important is when you look at the European bureaucracy, is that basically from the 60s to the 90s, the people were working in the DG, what we call at that time DG Dev, which was a development directorate in Brussels, were mainly engineers because of that focus on infrastructure. And gradually they were replaced. And what we can say now is that there's very few engineers left, and there are a lot of managers, actually. So that was also a sociological transformation of the EU bureaucracy that was important. Then, of course, it was the other important internal transformation was the fact that, as it was said before, Europe has decided to be an international actor and to build a common foreign policy, and therefore develop some tools about that. And it had some very serious implication for the aid policy, and it actually changed the European aid policy. And I think the interview that we had at the beginning revealed those changes and how they have been perceived by the Africans. There were two main trends, I would say, or three main trends from the beginning of this century when it comes to the EU aid policy. The first one was an increasingly bureaucratized policy. Has been in Brussels, they added layers of procedures and bureaucracy, and that makes the delivery of European aid very complex and very bureaucratic. And of course, as the principle of the European Development Fund from the beginning was co-management of the aid, it meant that the African had to be able to reach the standards of the European. And so it was a big problem. Yeah, I forgot to mention that co-management, the idea of co-management of aid was invented from the very beginning, from the 60s, 70s in the European policy. And it's important because now with the new instrument for development, there is no co-management anymore, and that's a problem. So the first thing is the bureaucratization of the over-bureaucratization of the delivery of aid. The second tendency is the securitization of the aid policy. The first speaker talked about the migration, and we all know what happened at the Valletta summit and when the migration crisis started, etc. And there's been a very strong focus by Brussels on the securitization of its policies in Africa, with the concept of, that you've probably heard, the nexus between development and security, saying that there cannot be any development without security, and no security without development. So it's good on paper, but in practical terms, it's a bit complicated. And so this securitization of development policy, which target mainly two issues, migration and terrorism, has been one of the main trends. The last trend is the politicization of the aid policy, with the fact that, as we say, one of the key transformations of the EU over the past 20 years is the fact that it wants to be now a geopolitical actor. It wants to assert itself on the international stage and therefore develop its own foreign policy. And therefore, the result is that the aid policy has been now subordinated to diplomatic objectives, diplomatic goals of the European Union. So that's I will stop there, the whole issue of the European summits will illustrate a bit what I've been saying now. But there's definitely been a growing mutual frustration on both sides because of that evolution that I've just summarized for you. And especially, and it was also mentioned by the first speaker, because now Africa has become a real battleground for influence from a lot of international actors. It's not only like it used to be during the Cold War, an area for competition between great powers, but it's even an area for competition between middle powers, basically. So, for instance, you have Turkey, who is very active in Africa since basically the beginning of the century, and who has developed its own Africa policy, with its own summit. You have also the Gulf countries that are quite active, and the problem of all those new actors who are coming into Africa is that they bring with them their own rivalries and problems. Just to give you an example, when the Gulf crisis started in 2017 between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, it immediately resonated in Africa, and especially in Muslim African countries, who were pressurized by both sides to pick up a side, basically. And so some African countries severed ties, diplomatic ties with Qatar or with Saudi Arabia, and were forced to position themselves into a rivalry where they basically had nothing to do. It is the same if you look at, for instance, the engagement of Japan and India in Africa, and especially in East Africa. One of the drivers of that engagement is the Chinese engagement in Africa, actually. And it's because they are very much looking at what China is doing that they also go where China is going. So that's, and last but that is very topical, is Russia. As you may or may not know, Russia has rediscovered Africa after the first crisis in Ukraine in 2014, where they basically launched a diplomatic offensive, doing visits that they were not doing anymore, etc., and starting to rebuild ties that have vanished, basically. And of course, it was not because of Africa, but it was because of the sanctions against Russia, and to show that they were not isolated on the international stage. So a lot of new actors, and I'm saying that because of the talk that we've heard about there are alternatives, you're not the only one on the international stage. Well, for sure, Europe is not the only one on the international stage in Africa, but what is also pretty clear is that the other actors come with their own interest and their own policy, and sometimes their own policy looks like very much the old policies, if I may say so. Just to give you an example, there's a lot of talks about, that is strange to me, about the fact that Chinese aid has no string attached and there's no interference from Chinese in there. Well, the string attached to Chinese aid for every country in Africa and elsewhere is you don't recognize Taiwan. That's the first condition. If you want to get Chinese aid, you don't recognize China. And there are also some more subtle conditionalities. But the idea that Europeans have conditionalities and the other actors don't have conditionalities is actually false perception. And I think there's a lot of false perception about those new actors in Africa, to echo what you've just said, especially about Russia, especially about China, Turkey, and others, who are playing also their own interests and their own realpolitik. And the problem for Africans now is that it is time, because of the very tense international context, everybody's playing real politics, and as they are the poorest on the planet, of course, it's a problem. If I can say conclude, I'm sure, because I see you're looking at me, so it probably means that it's time for me to conclude. We are used to talk about Africa, and it's actually a very wrong thing to do, because there is no Africa, there are Africas, in plural. Africa is made of it's made of 54 states, and those states have very various situations, both political and economic. But just to maybe simplify and give you a bit of context, basically 60% of the poor people in the world are Africans. If you look at the 20 poorest country in Africa, 17 of them are 7 of the poorest country in the world. 17 of them are Africans. Those who are not Africans are Afghanistan, Yemen, and Haiti. But however, you have some parts of Africa who are middle-income countries. Basically, Northern Africa, except Libya, of course, but the whole of Northern Africa is middle-income countries. Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, very few sub-Saharan African countries. But basically, Northern Africa is quite different from a social and economic point of view than the rest of Africa, and that's actually one of the reasons why you had those revolutions that failed in Northern Africa, and you didn't have the same kind of phenomenon in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much. That gives a lot of thinking to us. Irene Horace, she is the next speaker. She has been an official of the European Union for 20 years. She's Austrian. She served as EU ambassador in Niger from 2000 to 2004, and in Mali up to 2007, and then in Latin American countries. Before that, she did work on development with NGOs and with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this is, I think, when we met for the first time. Irene,
quite a long time ago, actually.
A long time ago.
Yesterday. Yeah, it's kind of yesterday, yeah. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Georg, for giving me the floor, and thanks also for inviting me to this panel. I am going to retake, to some extent, the issue from the beginning. So I've been asked to have a looking back to the development of EU policies towards Africa, and how this growing divide between Africa and the EU came about, and to analyze quickly also what are the main points of disagreement or the main irritants in this relationship. And at the end, if there is time or no, at the end of the discussion, perhaps some ideas how to go forward. One is when this panel started, originated because of the Brussels summit. And so the Brussels summit actually was a summit between the EU and the African Union. So I think that is very important at the point also to say a little bit a word on the African Union. So the African Union actually originated in 1999, 2000, was founded from predecessor organization, and then the EU by the time was very much a development aid provider and had very much development relations with African countries. Supported very strongly this idea because after the Maastricht Treaty, the EU policy became more political. There was a political mandate, and so the EU jumped on the occasion also and supported very strongly the establishment of the EU. So and indeed, I remember that I was in Brussels when we had even partnering sessions with the African Union officials. So African Union officials came on twinning arrangements in the organizations. And I think it's not a coincidence that we have an African Union which has exactly the institution the European Union has. So there is an African Union Commission, there is an African Union Council, there is an African Union Court of Auditors, so etc. So and so it was thought of building up a kind of vis-a-vis and partner to which with whom having an eye-to-eye dialogue, with whom to act on global issues, etc. So, and it was under the Portuguese presidency in 2007 when there was also made a joint, the first joint EU-AU strategy. So which focused very much, and it was a joint strategy, and which focused very much on peace and security, but on a dialogue on peace and security, on cooperation in climate change, support to infrastructure, trans-African networks, we called it by that time, the university and science cooperation, but also a kind of Erasmus for Africa, so a Nyerere program for Africa, and also very much on trade and investment. So the existence of the African Union, and to some extent also its successes, because the African Union has had some successes, is somehow also a success story from this early cooperation with the EU. The EU by then, since there was from the beginning also a very strong focus on dialogue on peace and security, the EU then generated something which was a financial instrument which was called the African Peace Facility to finance, to support African peace operations. So African Union in the following, so build it, peace operation capacity, mediation capacity, and also capacity for conflict prevention. And I think it was certainly, peace and security is certainly one of the most successful, most successful policies of the African Union. So then, from 2010 onwards, with the Lisbon Treaty, so and the creation of the European External Action Service, so as was already said, the action of the European Union in Africa became, and also the financial support became much more politicized. So the EU appointed also an EU ambassador to the African Union, established a proper military capacity to participate in military operation. And some of you will remember certainly that Atalanta in the Horn of Africa was one of the first military operations in which the EU participated. Then, and in the following, the EU policy became more and more reactive to geopolitical priorities, to issues which happened in the political environment, and also to domestic pressure, to EU domestic pressure, since there was, the push was very much on external policy and much more policy-minded than development-minded. So suddenly also the direction of EU policy was much more subject also to member states' approval and to interference of member states. So there was, you will certainly remember, so in 2011, the Arab Spring, which shed light on democracy failures in the Middle East, on human rights violation, on young people without employment perspectives, etc. The war in Libya, which then sparked the beginning of the Sahel crisis and the EU military engagement in the Sahel, the urgency, and in the following of that also the 2015 migration wave. I still refuse to call it a crisis. I think we made it out of it a crisis afterwards. And which triggered a very defensive approach on border control, fight against illegal migration, etc. So African countries were then pressured into a policing role on behalf of the African Union. And I remember the people in the Sahel also, and in particular in Niger, they said, since the EU moved now the borders of the EU to Agadez, and we are the policemen to control that. So so this very strong focus, and a very strong focus on security and migration. At the same time, there was a strong pressure on the multilateral agenda with the conclusion of climate change, of the climate change agreement with the Paris Agreement, and where the consent and the cooperation of African states were very much required. So over that decade to support that policies. So the EU, established more and more special financing instruments, which very much came all out of the same funding, by the way. So there was a proliferation of instruments, then also a kind of excessive weight on control the financing in African countries, all of which made the implementation of policies and the support to policies extremely heavy and slow. So while the EU policies were characterized by a strong narrative on partnership, on governance, democracy, human rights, youth, employment, jobs, civil society, etc., with an excessive focus on migration and security, the implementation of the support was very slow and little effective. One, certainly due also to corruption and lack of institutional capacity in African countries. Secondly, also because of the co-management of funds with African government went very often controversial. The EU multiplied financing instruments, I also said that. And the increasing bureaucracy and excessive controls made it all very slow and ineffective. So there was a very generous funding. So they had a lot of money to finance policies and policy support. And at the same time, there was disappointing results. So disappointing results which led at the EU side a sense of there is no progress in Africa. So a tendency also to turn away and to focus on other issues and other priorities, or turning away from Africa. And on the African side, the perception that African interests are not being considered, promises are not being fulfilled, a kind of being abused for EU interests, and the double standards regarding values, which was already mentioned. So a migration partnership, this disenchantment was even reinforced by a series of other contradictions, a partnership on migration without any door to illegal migration, so which was entirely focused on defense and on fencing of Europe. the perceived EU violations on human rights of the treatment of African migrants, the indicators on human rights and democracy when we talked to them, which were very much focused on EU standards, then free trade agreements, which could foster trade, but at the same time, technical barriers to trade increased. So at the same time, a lot of requests on sanitary controls, on phytosanitary measures, on a lot of other requirements which were linked to our policy on clean consumption, clean environment, etc. So Africa-Europe trade was increasing, but more due to extractive industries rather than production with added values. And a very important issue were also the negotiations on climate change. The climate change is an extremely important issue for Africa, but Africa is they are very little contributing to pollution and to climate change reasons. So the EU focused overly. Sorry, I didn't say anything so bad. So in these negotiations, you have usually two strands. One is on mitigation, how to reduce emissions, and the other one is how to adapt to the impact of climate change. So all international fora were focused on mitigation, which is also the European Green Deal, for example. And very little was done for adaptation, which was the need of them. And then, in order to get the Paris Agreement done, 100 billion yearly financing for adaptation and adjustment from development countries were promised, but at the same time, this promise was never delivered, or not delivered in that amount. So I think, so there was this giving some examples on the disenchantment and this growing divide between the EU and Africa. So when von der Leyen assumed then in 2000, there was an urgent need. So there was a sense of an urgent need to change the strategy and to bring the partnership on a new footing. So what was done so there was a quickly pull out of a new strategy. This time it was not a joint strategy. So we made just an EU strategy for Africa. A simplification also of financial instruments in order to make implementation quicker and easier, but also more adaptable to changing EU priorities. So I won't go into the details here because it goes too far. But and it was precisely this need for this need of this sense of urgency was done by the growing awareness that on the one hand, the EU is the major partner for Africa, so what with the figures that we have heard, but at the same time, Africa countries don't queue up anymore in order to sign an agreement with us or in order to wait for EU resources. There is certainly a vis-à-vis in Africa which is much more assertive. The countries, among the countries, the 55 countries, which are some are deeply in crisis-stricken, but others are also growing, and there is a kind of new assertiveness, and which is also due to the emergence of other partners. So we saw also a more assertive African Union, who had managed quite a lot of achievements. One, this African Union had established and launched in 21 an African continental free trade agreement in the context of African natural resources, 60% of young people, allowed for Africa also to present itself as an attractive market, and partly also Chinese, Turkey, not Russia, I would say, but Chinese, Turkey are also queuing up for that, or lining up to that. And on the other hand, there is also an awareness that if the EU wants to go on wants to proceed wants to success on global issues, it will also need these 55 votes, African votes in multilateral fora. They are also important votes, and each of the countries has a vote. So the African Union managed also to bring these voices together and to raise also a common voice, which has been said also in the beginning. And so there have been I think that there have been quite a lot of progress. So just to finalize on the last word, I want to say a word on the summit. So the last summit. The last summit was was a summit with provided a frank discussion on the irritants. Irritants were one, on COVID. On COVID, the EU had promised a lot of support, had not delivered. It was China which came up with the first support. It was not the EU. The EU was, AstraZeneca was produced in particular for developing countries. It was EU countries and Western countries who bought them all up. So there was a very bad handling on COVID. So African production, African wanted to push production, vaccine production on the continent, and requested a waiver of intellectual property waiver for the patent. And it was the EU who was the strongly opposed against. The US were not. So there were some, then Omicron, I think it was also said what happened with Omicron. So there was a very, very bad handling on that. Maybe I already talked about climate change. And so I think that which was an other irritant on it. So perhaps a last word on, so 2 words. On climate change, one thing which is very important on climate change is the energy transition. So there has been a lot of talk on energy transitions, a lot of rules on energy, on clean energy, and at the same time, African countries have a very different position. Some of them are energy importers, so they are very grateful for clean energy, alternative energies, etc. But others are producers also of gas, are producers of oil, and they need also to exploit their resources to finance development and their electrification. So, and the EU at the same time in this green financing policy has made very difficult that, for example, gas infrastructure or in industry and fossil energies has made very difficult multilateral lending for it. And a last word is on the big announcement on the global gateway. Yeah, so the global gateway, so which has been very much announced, the 150 billion for the global gateway, which I think it could be a very good opportunity. However, it will be seen on the detail how it will be implemented. So thank you very much. I'm very sorry for having for having been long. But anyhow, So, but the topic is also very...
Thank you. Stefan Gompertz, you have the enviable last position.
Not so sure.
But there's the pressure of time. No, just to present you a little bit what I had not known, I should have known after our last evening, that you have started out as a writer and lecturer on medieval literature in Yale University before entering a diplomatic career, which led him, among others, to Ethiopia. You were also Africa director, and you then were ambassador to Austria. And many of us remember you. I remember you for one particular thing. 14th of March 2013, an evening here in the Kreisky Forum on Mali, a few weeks after the intervention of French troops in Mali. It was a memorable evening, very lively, Malians very set up, and the discussion very much between the speaker for the Tuareg and the Malis. And that, I think, has really stayed as one of the most interesting evenings that we have had here. So, I will not cut your time. Stefan, please.
Vielen Dank, Georg. Es ist für mich eine große Freude, mich hier wieder zu befinden in meinem beliebten Wien und zumal hier in diesem schönen Forum und besonders mit dir. Wir haben schon schöne Gespräche zusammen gehabt. But unfortunately, like the other speakers, I won't be very optimistic. Actually, what I've heard from our colleagues just reinformed the question I formulated when I tried to prepare this meeting. Should the title be a new partnership between Europe and Africa, or should it be, are we losing Africa? And indeed, there are a lot of disquieting signals. Many of them have been mentioned, so I don't need to be long. The first one, which has been mentioned already, is the decline of the European role or part in Africa, and especially in the African economy. Now, this should not be exaggerated, at least for two reasons. First, because the relative decline of Europe doesn't mean a decline in absolute terms. Indeed, while we're losing parts, shares in the market, our exports and our investments continue to grow. Second, for Africa itself, having new partners is quite healthy. It wouldn't be wise for Africa to continue to depend on an exclusive relationship with one continent or one part of the world. This being said, the diversification of Africa's relations with other parts of the world raises some difficult questions, and especially political ones. Let's take the example of China. What is the ultimate objective of China? Is it merely economic? Is it commercial? Or is it political? Now I'm turning to my friend Joël Ruet, who's the chairman of the Bridge Tank, who's come to Vienna to participate in the discussion. He's a China specialist, so perhaps, Joël, you could give an answer to that question. But anyway, the question should be raised. After all, we know that now China has a military basis in Djibouti alongside the US and France. What does it mean? What are China's military and political ultimate ambitions on the continent? The second political difficult question I'd like to raise, and I don't have the answer, is will the diversification of partnerships, political partnerships, economic partnerships, mean that our values are declining? Thierry Vircoulon rightly pointed out to the emergence of new powers, especially medium powers like Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Some of them are democracies, like India. A very good friend of mine, Gurjit Singh, who was my Indian colleague in Addis Ababa, recently wrote a book about India's links with Africa. The book is called The Harambee Factor. Harambee means in Swahili, pulling together. Obviously, you can discuss some aspects of Indian policies, but this is not the subject. But what about others? What about Turkey? What should we think, how should we consider the fact that Turkey helps building new mosques and not particularly liberal ones on the African continent? What is the political influence, political influence of China on the continent mean? Couldn't it trigger or favor more favor for authoritarian regimes instead of democratic values? And the question deserves being discussed again. I don't have an answer, but clearly the decline of the European influence or the Western influence altogether on the continent could also mean a relative decline of democratic values, and perhaps this could be one of the numerous keys which could explain or help explain the very cautious attitude of African countries toward the Ukrainian crisis, which has been referred to. Since I mentioned Ukraine, just one word about Russia. Indeed, Margaret, I think you invited me to say a few words on this. There seems to be growing hostility to French presence, at least in some parts of the African continent, especially in Western and Central Africa, which goes alongside a growing favor for a Russian presence, or perhaps even intervention. The best example, obviously, is Mali. On the 2nd of May, Mali denounced the status of force agreements, what we call a SOFA, with French and European partners. But there are other countries involved, and we've seen demonstrations, hostile demonstrations against France's military presence or European military presence in Burkina Faso and even in Niger. Recently, the Ministers of Defense of Cameroon and Russia signed a military agreement in Moscow on the 12th of April. Now, we could argue that it was nothing really new, since such an agreement already been signed in 2015, and it was not renewed in 2020 due to COVID. But still, the fact that right now, in April, Cameroon deems it wise to sign a new military cooperation treaty with Russia can be a cause for concern. Even in Senegal, in January 2022, there were riots against French business interests. Now, we could be argued that it was not against France precisely, but against Western present or economic interests. It was more plundering than political demonstrations, perhaps. But still, there's also there a cause of concern. I'd like to add that our relations with some African countries, and especially Sahel countries, are strained by the question, a very difficult question, on whether we should accept negotiations with extremist groups, jihadist groups, or not. For France, and probably for other European countries, is out of the question. We should not negotiate with terrorists. And for us, and it's a very sensitive question, especially in our for our military, the fact that they have assassinated a lot of French military pleads against negotiating with them. But some African governments say, look, we know that they're not angels, but after all, this is what negotiation is about. You don't negotiate with sheep, you negotiate with hostile groups, and you try and find an agreement. The more so, because what is involved is not only a political or security opposition, but also family links, communities, tribal links, and so on and so forth. So the situation is very, very complex. Should we, as France or French or European, dictate the behavior of African governments? Now, obviously, we would argue we're helping them militarily, so we have a say. Right. But there's a risk that we appear as dictators, so to say. The more so because, on one hand, we're often linked with discredited elites. Now, I haven't invented this, but this is what a good friend of mine, who's an African ambassador to Paris, told me about perhaps a month ago, we had a discussion, a very free discussion together. And he told me bluntly, he's a very good friend of mine, speaks French like a Frenchman, you, as Europeans, you're losing your credit because of your links with discredited elites. And on the other hand, we keep criticizing military regimes in Africa. Now, it doesn't mean that we should congratulate the Malian military for staging 2 coups successively, one after the other. Certainly not. But who are we to tell the Africans what their political regimes should be? The more so, because quite often those coups have been staged against unpopular governments, and the military regimes, for the time being, it might not last, but for the time being are quite popular with local public opinions. So perhaps we should be more careful about our pronouncements, and particularly our political pronouncements. I'm speaking for France, now I'm retired so I can speak freely, but I think it also applies to the European Union. And that could also be one of the explanations why some African governments are tempted to deal either with China or with Russia, because they know that neither China nor Russia nor Turkey probably will criticize the African governments for not being democratic. We are incurring the risk of being accused of the double standard approach. Reference has been made, rightly so, to the treatment, the differential treatment of Ukrainian refugees and African refugees in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis. We welcome the Ukrainians with open arms, but we left the Africans apart. Some countries, especially Poland, for instance, just repelled them. Some of them have managed to come to the other European countries. I can only speak for France, but I've read in the press, in French press, particularly in Le Monde, numerous examples of Africans having fled from Ukraine, finding it very difficult to obtain a residence permit in France, even though those people were university students or teachers, very qualified people who certainly could be also useful to our economy. So it seems that we, despite the beautiful proclamations, especially in Brussels, we tend to have sometimes a kind of short-sighted approach. I will not dwell again on health, because this has been dealt, but I totally agree with what my colleagues have said. For instance, on the issue of vaccines. I mean, the fact that perhaps it is exaggerated, but the fact that the South African president could say that European policies in the field of vaccination amount to vaccine apartheid is also a cause for concern. Now, the issue of patents, of property rights, obviously is a very difficult issue, but as you pointed out, the US has agreed to waive property rights, so has France, but other European countries have refused. Now, I understand that the question is going to be debated in WTO, in the World Trade Organization, so perhaps in 20 or 30 years we can hope for a solution. But in the meantime, obviously, the pandemic continue to develop. Another difficult issue, especially psychologically, is Europe's, France's in particular, but Europe's more generally, contribution to African security. You rightly pointed out to the development of Europe's assistance to African security. Fair enough, good, well done, good job. The problem is that the military presence of France on one hand, European forces on one hand, tend to perpetuate itself. And we know from history that at the beginning you welcome, but then when your troops remain on the ground, you become more and more unpopular. When we launched the Serval operation, it was, remember the discussion we had, it was very useful indeed. Hadn't we done that, Bamako would have been taken over by the jihadists. It would have been a catastrophe, not to mention all the 10,000 or 15,000 foreigners who are living in Bamako. So that was the right thing to do. Now the question is, should we continue to maintain our presence in the present terms? I don't have the answer. But clearly there's a feeling in the African public opinion, rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's justified or not. What matters is the feelings of the people, public opinion. There's a growing feeling that our presence is, first, not very efficient, because insecurity continues to grow, especially in Mali and Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, but we're not present in Nigeria, we just help them. And second, that the ongoing presence of our forces infringes upon the sovereignty of those countries. And hence the demonstrations against our presence. So clearly there's something to think about. I don't have the answers, or even though in just 2 minutes, and I will stop there, I will try and suggest just very modestly a few possible avenues, at least subjects which we could reflect upon. I'd like also to recall the food crisis. Whether the Brussels summit has been efficient or not will, to a large extent, be judged upon based on what we do with the food crisis. Can we help Africa, which is confronted with a very severe drought, plus the Ukraine crisis, the shortage of goods, and so on and so forth? Are we able to help Africa or not? But we're going to face shortages in Europe as well. So clearly, this is going to be a very difficult challenge. Now, I was saying that I would just humbly suggest some possible avenues, and because it is our interest. Even though, as Thierry Vircolon rightly pointed out, Africa in absolute terms and economic terms is not that important for us, but it is the continent of the future. I'm still very optimistic about the future of Africa, because Africa is developing rapidly, despite all the crises, not only in terms of population, but also in terms of economic output, in terms of education. Progress is amazing. I was able to witness that in Ethiopia, for instance. So it is our interest to revitalize, perhaps to change, but to revitalize our links with Africa, also to encourage Africans to accept, to endorse our values, even though they're being jeopardized by other players. So perhaps 6 possible avenues. Number 1, more solidarity in the light of the Ukraine crisis. Georg, you rightly recall what Moussa Faki said: Africa has become a collateral victim of the Ukraine war. That means that we should be more generous with refugees coming from Ukraine, residence permits, for instance. Second, again, I'm repeating myself, that we should contribute to food relief. Number 2, more realism in our policies towards insurgent movements, including jihadist movements. It is difficult to swallow, but we have to be realistic. It's not up to us to dictate to African governments what they should do. Number 3, and one goes along with the other, more realism in our attitude towards military regimes. Mali is perhaps a special case, because now I'm speaking as a Frenchman, the present military junta hasn't been very friendly to us. What about Burkina Faso? What about Guinea, for instance? They have military regimes. After all, why should we say, on one hand, rightly, like Macron said recently, we should not humiliate Russia, and I entirely agree with him, and why are we not careful enough not to humiliate African governments or African authorities, whatever we think of them? The more so because we can be accused of a double standard approach when our president, also rightly, goes to and attends Idriss Déby's funeral. I wouldn't say that Idriss Déby, our beloved ally and friend in Chad, was a really democratic leader. But We had strong ties with him, and he did the right thing. But then, why do we support his son's accession to power, and are we so critical of other military regimes? Number 4, more emphasis, and I think the European Union has started to embark on this, correct me if I'm wrong, more emphasis on the private sector, and especially on small and medium companies, and especially on companies which are run by women. I know a lot of efforts in made in that respect. Now, I'm a bit biased when I say that, because I happen to be a kind of diplomatic advisor to a French impact investment fund in Africa. What does it mean? It means that the fund invests in companies which obviously have to be profitable, because otherwise we would lose our money, but those companies have to promote values, have an impact either in the social area or in the area of the environment or in governance, especially relations with employees, men and women, etc. All this together. And this is a fundamental criteria which determines whether we're going to invest in those companies or not. So the more the European Union and its instrument, the European Investment Bank, for instance, will help those companies, the better. 2 more elements, I will stop here. We should enhance our support for NGOs. NGOs, civil society organizations, are a key element in the development of local civil societies, so local societies, generally speaking. I don't have the feeling that we are doing enough. When I was an ambassador to Ethiopia, for instance, I managed to grab some money from my government to help some Ethiopian NGOs, which were performing a fantastic job. Clearly, we could have done much more. And what I experienced when I was in Ethiopia, my colleagues have experienced in other African countries. It's very good to help governments, very good to help states, but the civil society organizations are of paramount importance. Last but not least, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that Europe has no communication policy at all. What about the youth? What about influencers? What about social networks? What about Instagram? What about TikTok? This is where Europe should speak to Africans, not only in beautiful multilateral fora in a luxury setting, leaving aside the overall population. Thank you very much.